as well as Professor Wolter's talk. All of us are very excited to learn about his work and to have a really interesting dialogue over lunch about what he's doing, as well as to kind of communicate between our own schools. We have faculty from the college as well as public policy and the Rossier School of Education. But let me first introduce the Consul General for Switzerland, Mr. Bruno.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, and Catherine, thank you so much for opening the doors of USC, Rossier School of Education, for having us today. Thank you, Andy, for organizing everything, and to all of you, it's wonderful to see such a numerous participation on a Monday lunch event in a very busy period, certainly for you. We have been engaged now we're engaged in the fourth day here in Los Angeles in various contacts and in establishing a dialogue in the field of education. We've met various partners from Rand Corporation to community colleges and different universities, and we certainly feel very privileged that you offer us this opportunity here to enter in dialogue and in discussion. This dialogue from our side has been possible thanks to a wonderful guest who has agreed to fly in from Switzerland, has accepted the invitation, and to do this program with us. We are fortunate with Professor Wolter to really have an expert in the width and depth of his knowledge and involvement. I think that's quite unique, being really involved in policy making at all levels of education in Switzerland. And before I hand over to him, I would like to tell you a few points out of the short bio, an excerpt. He is carrying so many hats on his head. Professor Stefan Wolter is Managing Director of the Swiss Coordination Center for Research in Education in Aarau, Switzerland. He's also the head of the Center for Research in Economics of Education at the University of Bern. Having previously served as the chief economist at the Federal Office for Industry and Labor and head of division at the Federal Office of Economic Development and Labor, he is also a visiting scholar at the W.E. Upjohn Institute for Employment Research in the US, guest lecturer for Economics of Education at the University of Trier in Germany, and consultant to the Directorate for Education of the OECD in Paris, and sits as Switzerland's representative on the governing board of the Center for Educational Research and Innovation of the OECD, is our representative in the OECD Education Committee, a member of the Council of the European Educational Research, and I could go on and on and on. But to conclude, of course, one of the main interests of Professor Wolter is his research field of economics of education, which includes topics such as labor market returns to education, general education finance, educational finance, finance of universities, teacher labor markets, apprenticeship training and job mobility, and educational transitions, student labor market expectations, and sibling effects on the student performance. Today, Professor Wolter will talk about experimental results of an experimental field research in vouchers for adult education. And please welcome Dr. Stefan Wolter.
Thanks for the invitation. I was afraid of having no time left for the presentation. That goes on and on and on. So, what I'm pleased to present to you this afternoon is a recent work with some co-authors on a field experiment that we have been doing in Switzerland in the years 2005 to 2007. And I thought that this topic would be of the interest of many. It's at the crossing of labor markets and educational system, and because it deals with adult education, it also deals with all the education that came before. So it will give you the links where you could step in and ask some questions about the Swiss system of education, if you like, and from time to time I will allude to that. So what you will hear in the next 40 minutes is mainly the experiment, some descriptive evidence, our strategy of estimation and the results. But first, the motivation. Well, in most countries, governments support lifelong learning. I guess more so in Europe than in the US, but in Europe this is widespread. A recent survey of interventions came up with some 94 different instruments currently in use in European countries to support adult education. The typical mechanisms, as mentioned here, are tax subsidies, grants, loans, subsidies to providers, etc. But as I said, they came up with almost 100 different instruments currently used by the different governments. Many, not many, but several countries have already used for quite some time voucher programs that should stimulate the participation of adults in continuous education. In Austria, Belgium, Italy, Germany, and Switzerland, in the sense that one canton. Switzerland has, as the US has 50 states, we have 26 cantons, and one canton since the year 2001 is using a comprehensive voucher scheme for his adults. So far the other cantons have not wanted to follow that example, and the initiative behind that research that I am talking about was the fact that we had a vote on a new amendment to the Swiss Constitution. And in this amendment, it said that the government can, if the government wants, support adult education. So the question came up, should we introduce that voucher system in the whole of Switzerland? And before the government wanted to decide, they said, well, let's make some research about this. And one of the most prominent instruments that was in discussion was vouchers. So the government asked us at the university, could you make some research and tell us what impact such a voucher program would have on adult education if we would introduce it at a full scale in the country. The problem is it's little is known about what happens if you put in place such a voucher system. We don't know whether it's just all dead weight loss, whether we just to support people who would have come to these courses anyway. And we don't know whether those people who have been attracted to those courses with the help of the vouchers, so where we have a causal impact of the voucher on participation, whether the participation itself leads to better labor market outcomes, which is the ultimate or final goal of such a government intervention. So that these two things were the questions that we dealt with in this research. The first part is covered in another paper, so I will briefly touch on this during that presentation, the take-up rates, the causal impact, because the causal impact will be the identification strategy in this paper, but I will briefly touch on this. It's more on the second part, whether the participation in education had an impact on labor market outcomes. Well, the theoretical background, why should governments support adult education? It can be justified if there are market failures. In economic terms, For example, liquidity constraints, budget constraints. There are households where participation in continuous education would make sense, but it's costly, and those people do not have the funds to pay for that education, and because they cannot fund it, they don't do it, but it would have had a positive impact on their own labor market status, and finally, of course, also for the government as such, because higher tax revenues, etc., or lower social assistance would have been a motivation to fund these individuals to overcome these budget constraints. Another problem could be imperfect information about the returns. It's a risky investment. Not every of these programs turns into profits, so it might be that some adults refrain from doing it because they don't want to bear the risk. So if you would pre-finance or finance that adult education via a voucher, that could lead to increase in the participation rates. So in these cases and others, public support could improve the situation. On the other hand, you know, all Jim Heckman is touring the world with his results that early interventions are more effective than late. So, of course, when you believe this, then the effectiveness of such interventions is little. But the problem is that if we start now investing in the young instead of the old, it will take generations till we have solved all the problems. And the problem is, what do we do with the cohorts of adult population that is already on the labor market? Do we just forget about them and wait for 40 years till the situation has improved? So the government says, no, actually, even if we believe that the effectiveness of early interventions is higher, we still have to do something about the adult population that we have today, and especially in times of the demographic decline in the number of people that we have in our country. The empirical challenge is that we do not know what the returns to these this participation is, and we have reasons not to believe the conventional estimates of returns to adult education. The reason is because there is a high selection in the people attending adult education going on at the moment. So if you would find high returns to adult education of those who participate in adult education today, it wouldn't tell you much about the returns to be expected of those who are not participating at the moment. It might be due to the causes I have been citing before, budget constraints, imperfect information, etc., that they would have the same returns. But it could also be that you already have a very efficient selection going on. That means all those who can expect positive returns are doing it, and all those who would expect low returns are refraining from doing it. So in that case, if the government would stimulate people into continuous education who have no returns to expect, that would be quite a different situation from what we see when we observe the behavior of people who are doing it at the moment. So what this study does is, first of all, we set up a large-scale randomized field experiments with vouchers. I will tell you in a couple of minutes about the precise setup of the experiments. And we exploit the variation, the exogenous variation that this assignment to voucher has provoked. It's like it's a shock to participation rates, and we use that exogenous shock to participation rates to identify whether the participation in adult education has positive impacts on earnings, employment status, subsequent participation in adult education. And we also analyzed a lot of other things, but these are the three main factors I will touch on in the coming minutes. Just to tell you the previous evidence from labor economics, there's not much that is comparable to what we are doing. There's some literature on on-the-job training within firms, also US American literature. There is literature on formal education for returning adults. This is, I have to say, a little bit different from what we are doing. In our case, adult education is a typical ongoing, we also label it continuous education process, where people who already have completed formal education at later stages of their life, just update their skills. They go in for a 1-week course, for a 2-week course, just to be up to date with their skills in the labor market. It is not adult education in the sense that you didn't complete your schooling when you were young, and at the age of 40 you're going back to school. That's not what we consider here. And just to give you a figure, on average, it's about 30 to 40% of the Swiss adult population, you will see that in a minute, that participates at least once in a year in a paid-for continuous education program that can last a day, it can last a month or more. That's a huge variation in that. If you take these 30–40%, what you see on an international scale, the US has about the same figure. So in the US, the same comparable statistics tell us that the participation of adult US population in that kind of courses is about the same as in Switzerland. It's much more in the Nordic European countries where this is heavily subsidized by the state. There you get up to rates of 50, 60, and 70%. And it's much less in Southern Europe or developing countries where it goes down close to zero. And the European Union has just made the participation rate in that kind of adult education as a goal. So they have in their Lisbon goals for education, the participation rate in this type of adult education figures as a goal. I don't remember the exact percentage, but I think it's about, they expect 50% of the population to be engaged at least once per year in that kind of training. There is a relation to public sector training for people who have been unemployed, but that's not really comparable because that is even a more select group of people. The only thing which is important, I think, to take from this kind of research is that research on unemployed people, where training is provided to them to re-enter the labor market, bears rather disappointing results around the world. So we all believe in education and training, but if we look at these studies, we always find that the returns are pretty small, if not zero. So, I mean, if our adult population that we look at on now, which is the one that has not participated in the past in any kind of activities, probably is more comparable to these unemployed people, what we're going to expect is probably lower results than we find from other studies. So that's what I told you. So our contribution is that we do something new. We try to overcome a lot of selection issues by our randomized field experiment. So the experiment was initiated in 2005. So at the end of that year, everything was in place. It was mandated by the government, and we took advantage of the situation that we have an ongoing Swiss labor force survey, as in all countries. In our country, it's a yearly survey. It's a rotating panel. People stay on that survey for 5 years, and then they are exchanged by others. And what we were able to do was, due to a reduction in the sample size of the labor force surveys, they ran out of money, and they had to reduce the sample of the labor force survey. So they had to kick out randomly thousands of people of the survey. So what we did was, we got a random sample of 2,400 and some people who were supposed to be kicked out of the survey because they hadn't the money to finance that anymore. They had been interviewed already before in 2004 or 2005, and many of them in 2004 and 2003. And they were scheduled to be interviewed again in 2006. So what we did was we financed this extra part of the survey. So when they were interviewed in 2006, they thought they were still in the normal sample. It's because nobody told them that you were kicked out. And those individuals got a voucher. So they got a voucher. At the beginning of the year, they got an official letter from the statistical office containing a voucher. The letter stated that this was a part of a project, but because they were participants of the labor force survey, they were particularly suited to receive this gift. So the thing was that because no public domain information was generated on the experiment, those who got the voucher thought that everybody in the labor force survey had gotten a voucher. Proof for that was that some people sent an email, one person even sent an official letter to the government complaining about the waste of taxpayers' money if thousands of people got a voucher in this country. So they believed, they were not aware that this was an experiment. They just thought, oh, because I participated in the labor force survey, I got a gift, and I can use that now. And the other thing was that the control group, that's the other people, in the remaining people, which is the bigger fraction of the people in the labor force survey who did not get a voucher, they had no idea that other people got a voucher. It's so thinly spread, the number of participants in the country, that you can even suppose or assume that there is no information among people, because that would be highly coincidental if somebody would know someone else who is in the labor force survey. So actually we could go on from the principle that nobody, either in the control group or the treatment group, was knowing that there was an experiment going on. We thought that this was very important because compared to other social interventions with a lot of social experiments, people in the control group know, people in the treatment group know that they are used or abused as part of an experiment, so that people are looking at them. And people in the control group also know that there is something else going on and that they belong to the control group. And there's a lot of concern that people alter their behavior because they know they are looked at, and they know that they either are in the control or treatment group, and that can blur the differences between the two groups. So we took everything possible not to create that situation. We had two sub-experiments, which I will not talk about today. We had the sub-experiment. We wanted to know something about the price elasticity of demand for these vouchers. So we subdivided randomly the group of 2,400 people into three categories. So one got 200, 750, and 1,500 Swiss francs. Now in US dollars, it's changing every day, but roughly you can take these as dollar values. So $200, $750, $1,500. So we used a small amount, but also quite a big amount to see whether a substantive voucher would trigger a different response than small amounts. They do, but it's flattening out after the 750. It's not linear. It's flattening out after the $750. And another sub-experiment, which I will not talk about here because it didn't generate any difference in the group, was then, again, we randomly divided the treatment group into two. One half got free counseling, because another issue in adult education is that especially the pedagogues say it's not about money, it's about information. And the problem of adult education, why some groups do not participate in adult education, is because there's a huge intransparency in this market, and they don't know where to start. And those people are not the most literate people, and they don't want to spend hours and hours looking for programs that will suit them. So this is the burden why they don't do it. It's not, they would have money, but they don't have the knowledge to find the appropriate programs. So the sub-experiment consisted by giving half of those people the possibility of free counseling. So with the voucher, they got a toll-free telephone number, and it was told that if you call that number, you can get free counseling over the phone as much as you want. Now the thing was that out of these 1,200 people, only 90 people called the number. Now you can think about this whatever you want, but apparently 1,100 people thought, I don't need that information. And we looked at the behavior of the group who got that offer of free counseling compared to the behavior of those who didn't get that, and the behavior is the same. So even the 90 people didn't change anything in the behavior. So unfortunately we were not allowed to look deeper into the 95 or so people. It would have been quite interesting to see what those people were doing. Because of data protection issues, we were not allowed to look into the 95 people. But overall, on the average, we can say, well, all the effects we have found related to money, they can be demonstrated. All the things about information didn't show any effect, so perhaps we should rewrite a little bit the history or the story about non-participation in adult education. What was also important was that the use was really free choice. We didn't want to limit the choice, because that was also part of the experiment, to see what are they doing. So they could do everything. They could go to an MBA, a cooking class, whatever they did, because we got information back what they did, and we also get precise information about the content of the programs of all other people in the control group. So we wanted to see what are they doing if they get the chance to do that. Yeah, so this was the thing, and the control group was 17,000 people who had been also interviewed a year before, were scheduled to be interviewed in 2006, and most of them in 2007, which is the year I will cover in the coming slides. There was a little limitation we had. We only granted the vouchers to people between 20 and 60, because we thought for the government it's not very interesting to see what people at the age of 80 or 85 are doing, so we restricted it to the people in the normal working age. The descriptive evidence, just quickly, the redemption rate was less than 20%. It's more than 20%, it's about, if I recall it correctly, 25% or so for the higher nominal values of the vouchers, and it's about 12% for the $200 voucher. Overall, it's 18%. Now here, especially well-educated people as we are all, we say, wow, this is so low. If I would have gotten a voucher with even $200, but especially the one with 1,500, and that was a group of 800 people, I would have used it right away. And all the people I know tell me the same. But actually, this is not much higher than we got in non-experimental voucher treatments that we saw in other countries. There was a small experiment going on in the northern part of Italy years ago, not experimental in our sense. They had a redemption rate of 10%, so it's not unusual. And the other thing you will see in the coming slides is that there is also adult education that is paid for by employers, and so actually those who get it from employers, well, even if they got the voucher, they would have had to go to an extra, and what we see is they didn't. So if they already had paid continuous education by their employer, on average they didn't use the voucher either. So the overall group that is doing continuous education is much larger than the 18%, but the 18% is the group of people who use them. So we looked at the categories of content. Only 10% were courses we could not really label as work-based or labor-related. So we don't know whether all of these 10% are really leisure courses, but that would be the upper bound of courses. So most of the courses were taken in fields where they are really directly job related. By content, most of the courses fell in the domain of foreign language courses. We are a country with 4 national languages plus English gives 5, so you see there is a constant need for Swiss people to update their language skills. So foreign language is also a language which is a national language, but it's considered foreign if it's not your mother tongue. 21% IT courses, and we even have precise information about what kind of IT course. So it was programming, things like that. It was not how do I play Nintendo. So one of the things you would always like to look at before believing into an experiment is whether the treatment group and the control group were roughly the same. Actually, you see here that on 3 items they were different, And this was due to things that can just happen if you outsource the randomization. We're not allowed to do the randomization. The randomization was done by the Federal Statistical Office. And when we got the data, we saw that there were too many Swiss nationals in the treatment group. And because of that, we also have the difference in vocational education and university education, because more Swiss have vocational education than foreigners, and less Swiss have a university degree. So that caused, so based on nationality, these two other things would cancel out. But why we had more Swiss in our sample than in the control group, even the statistical office afterwards was not able to tell us. But these are the things that can happen. So what we do in the end is we, even if in a very good balanced experiment, you would not need any control variable. That's the issue of making an experiment. We still use the control variables to ensure that there is no bias because of this bias in the treatment group. Actually, we did it also without control variables. It doesn't seem to be important. What is important here is the fact that, different from other kinds of experiment, there was no possibility of people to influence their belonging to the treatment or the control group. That is the most important in a social experiment. So the people were handpicked by the Federal Statistical Office and allocated. So they had no say in which group they belonged. They didn't even know that they belonged to one of these groups. So that's the most important thing, because then even if in the controls everything would be the same, but people had a possibility to influence their status, you might see some underlying biases because of some unobservables that are relevant to the outcome. Now this thing can be excluded. In the 2007 data, so that was the sample that was created, but then you have sample attrition over the year. Actually quite amazing high attrition. So usually 20% of the people in the labor force survey, when they are contacted next year, they don't respond anymore. So we have an attrition rate of 20% every year. So we also have attrition rates here, and the question was whether the attrition rates affected the samples differently. Well, the things remain with regard to some educational values, and this is again related to the Swiss. But here now there's a difference in adult education before the experiment started. Now the treatment group had a higher participation rate in the year before the experiment. The reason for that is that the voucher apparently also worked as some sort of gift exchange. That means that people who got the voucher had a higher probability of responding to following rounds of the survey, and actually only the people who had used the voucher. So that's another paper we have written. Because it's interesting to see that if you got a voucher but you didn't use it, your response rate the next year is the same as for people who did not get a voucher. But the people who got a voucher and used the voucher have significantly higher response rates in the following years. So they regarded this as a gift, and if you know the literature about gift exchange, so they reciprocated to the gift by answering in the next round. So we also have to control for participation prior to the experiment. So these are other differences. So you see the difference that is most important now. That's an impact of the experiment. In 2006, the control group had an on average participation rate of 33%. That's in the year of the experiment. And the treatment group of 44%. So the causal difference, the causal impact on adult education were the 12 percentage points. And if you take the control group as the baseline, so you can say by a third, the participation in continuous education was increased by a third by issuing or giving out the voucher. Then, of course, it should have impacted the self-financed, because that's what you usually do with the vouchers. So here you see that impact. And it had a little substitution effect on firm finance. So in 2000, at least for the 2007 sample, we can see that people having got a voucher had a significantly lower probability of receiving firm finance continuous education, because probably when they got the voucher, they could do what they wanted to do, and if their employer said, you should do this, they said, I'm already doing it because I got a voucher. So there is there's a substitution effect, a small one, but it's also something to consider. If you do that at large scale, it's not only the dead weight in the sense that people use the voucher for things they would have done anyway, there's even the possibility of substitution for other sources of payment. The hourly earnings in 2007 of both groups are pretty much the same. Employment probability also. Adult education, it's a little bit higher, significantly higher for the people who got the voucher in the year after the experiment. So the estimation strategy, I will go very quickly here. So we calculate regression where the outcome is either earnings, employment status, or subsequent participation in adult education. The explaining variables are some background variables, and especially also an indicator for participation in self-finance training. Now, if you do that, this thing would be biased because of the selection into adult education. Longitudinal data would help you to overcome this. Longitudinal data means that the outcome, you also have past outcomes of this outcome variable in the explaining variables. So for example, if that would be earnings, and you want to see whether participation in adult education has influenced your earnings, then if you take the earnings that person had the year before the person took part in adult education, that already takes you out a lot of the selection effect, because what you typically see is that the better people, the higher educated people, and therefore also the people with higher earnings, they participate more in adult education. So if you measure that those people who participated have higher earnings, actually they already had higher earnings before. So if you use that previous data in your explaining set of variables, you can cancel out a lot of the selectivity, but not all. So we do both. Now, what we do is we use an IV strategy, instrumental variable. So what we do is we first estimate the participation in adult education where the voucher is our instrument, because that's the exogenous shock. We give vouchers, and that triggers some causal impact, as we have seen, 12%. In adult education, and that variation, only that variation, the exogenously caused variation, then is used in the IV strategy in the explanation of the outcome, so that we can see when we shock the system, does it produce a shock in the outcome? And that should be free of selection issues. The only thing is, this is a so-called LATE, a local average treatment effect. What it means is we can only measure the impact of the participation in adult education on the outcome of those people who have been responsive to the shock. So the figures I will show you are not an average that could be expected if everybody would participate in adult education. For those people who we were not able to shock with the voucher, we cannot calculate their return to adult education. So it's a local average treatment. Local means we can only calculate the effect of those people who were responsive to the voucher. That's all. Now, you would say, oh, that's not the whole of the story. I would be interested in seeing what happens with the 60% who never participate in adult education, what their returns would be. Well, we too, but there is no strategy to do this. We would have to force them to go into adult education, and that would be biased again by the forcing. We all know this. But the other thing is, from a public economics or from a public perspective, actually we are more interested in this group than in the others, because the government is spending money, and what the government wants to see is whether those people who were responsive, who used the voucher, created cost for the government, whether they have a return. That's the group that the government is interested in. Okay, and then the reduced form, the ITT, the intention to treat effect. It's a normal OLS regression where we just put in voucher and not voucher used and not adult education, but just they got a voucher. So the ITT effect is whether the group who has got a voucher differs in the outcomes from the group that has not got a voucher. That's close to the descriptives that you have seen, a little bit augmented by controlling variables. Why is this? It's interesting, but at the same time confusing if you can't disentangle the effects. This is a combined effect of take-up rates and returns. Imagine that the take-up rates would be very high. All the people in the treatment group would participate in adult education, but the returns would be 0. Then the ITT would be 0 too. Imagine that the take-up rate is very low, but the returns to those people who have doing it is very high. Then it still might be that the ITT is 0, because only so few people have been participating, so that even their high returns wouldn't matter in the overall sample. So a 0 effect can be caused by either low take-up rates or low returns. So if you only would look at ITT, you wouldn't know where the effect comes from. Now actually we got some descriptive evidence about the take-up rates. It's not that high, we already know about this, but now if the effect is not there, we still do not know whether it's the returns or whether it's the take-up rate that is causing low ITTs. So we use these 3 outcomes measures. I already showed you this. One problem perhaps is these are short-run effects, in the sense that we measure things 12 to 18 months after the adult education took place. Is it a problem? Well, if this participation in education should have an impact, we should see it somewhere near the education. I don't think that we could assume that taking a programming course 2 weeks would show up in your salaries only 5-10 years later after the course. It might be that you have combined effects, because once you participate in that, you participate the next year, etc. That's another thing. But that's a limitation. We could only see whether it has an impact on the outcomes 1 year to 1.5 years later. So I hope you can see that this is the estimation on earnings. So the OLS, what the OLS is doing, so that's a classical wage regression, is here we start with a regression that has almost no control variables, just the age, gender, nationality, and then the training. And you can see if you only control for this, there seem to be huge returns to adult education. This is firm-based training increases your salary next year by 12%, if it's self-financed by roughly 7%. Now, of course, now we include step-by-step control variables, and in the latest we also include the salary that we had in 2005. So till here we do something that is known in the literature as using that longitudinal data to get out as much of the selection effects. So this is as much as the previous literature has been doing in the past, and you can see that the returns are going down. But even controlling for everything that you can observe, there's a still positive return. Now 3% or 1.5% salary increase the year after the education took place. Now we compare that with our IV strategy. So the first stage is showing whether the voucher has an impact on adult education. It does. Then we calculate whether it's a good instrument. It is. It passes the tests of being a good instrument, because the problem with IVs is if you have a bad instrument, the results are poorer than if you would do nothing. So you have to see whether your instrument is a valid one. So both on statistical and theoretical grounds, it's the case. Then we do the second stage, and the second stage produces something which is not uncommon. The standard errors gets inflated, but the coefficient is near zero. It's almost zero. It's even a little bit negative. And the ITT showed you shows approximately the same, and here the standard error is small, but again, this is the combination of the take-up rate and the return. But now, even if you would say, okay, well, we can't do better than this, this is a heterogeneous thing, the standard errors are there, but the coefficient is zero, but the ITT is 0 too, and with a lot of confidence it's 0. Just to tell you something about this, usually what happens in IVs is, well, the standard error gets up, but usually what you also get, if you look at normal IV papers, you get huge coefficients. Then the problem you have is you have huge coefficients but huge standard errors, and you don't know whether to trust these coefficients. Here, and you will see that through the picture, you always find the coefficient is always 0, 0, 0, even with a high standard error. So this is the same, but for employment. So this is the probability of being still in employment the next year. You see the same. People who do that, who participate in adult education, have significantly higher probabilities of still being employed the next year. But this could also be reverse causality. So if you find here positive, highly significant positive impacts, it could be a demonstration of a reverse causality problem. If you expect yourself not to be in employment next year again, because you know I will retire, or my wife just changed job and I want to follow her and I give up my job, or something like that, you decide not to participate in adult education anymore because it will be useless for you. Now, you don't participate, the next year you are unemployed. Now, the unemployment or the non-employment is not a cause of your non-participation. Your non-participation is a cause of the expected non-employment next year. So that's a classical thing where we even have to worry more about what we find in the OLS. Again, the situation is absolutely the same. The coefficient is really literally 0, and the ITT the same again. Subsequent participation in adult education, this is a classical effect that you find in many papers. Participation in 1 year has a huge impact on participation next year. So what you think that happens out there is that some people do that, and if they do that, they do it all the time, again and again. And actually, this is what you see in the OLS. Now here again, it's the same picture, but one difference. The difference is that is not 0. It's 12%. Now the standard error again is huge, so it's not significantly different from 0. But here you can wonder. Now all you can say is even with one standard deviation plus, we would still be away from this effect here. So the only thing we can say here is we should not rule out the possibility that participation due to the voucher had a causal impact on participation next year. The coefficient is not 0. But what we can learn from this is that probably the OLS estimates are still overestimations of what is going on, really. In the ITT form, it's much lower then, of course, but because the take-up rate is here multiplied by the impact. So what we also did was we used subgroups, subpopulations to do the same things, and also the ITT effects for these subpopulations. These are the OLS effects. I jump over them because of time, and these are the ITT effects. The ITT effects are, so we don't take the whole, so we just divide by gender or by educational degree, and we measure what impact the voucher had on the behavior. This is what happened in 2006. So here you can see the causal impact of the voucher on the subgroups. And you can see the higher educated you were, that's not something surprising. I mean, the goal of the experiment was just to find out what the size was. We expected that, but we wanted to see how big is the size. So those people who already had a good education from the start, they used the voucher more, and even the causality is high. And those who just had a compulsory schooling degree as their highest educational degree, that was half or even a third of what people did with a tertiary education. Earnings, employed, adult education, these are all our outcome variables in 2007. You can play around with the coefficients and the signs, but the problem is on all the subgroups there are no significant effects. Then we did, if you look in the paper, complier analysis. So who is complying? That means who is responsive to the voucher. I jump over this because the final result is just what you have seen before. Those who already had a good education to start with, they complied, and those who have not, did not, that's the complier analysis. I go to the conclusion. So overall, the labor market effect is pretty much close to zero. So even for the latte, for those people who were responsive to the voucher, and even taking into account that we saw that they were doing educational programs that were job related, we have no average effect on the participation rates in adult education on employment. So we can, but we had one on the 2007 that cannot be ruled out completely, but we can exclude the possibility that the large persistence of adult education found in the OLS is fully causal. Highly selective participation as expected. There are heterogeneous results to start with in adult education, and the tentative conclusion from our paper is especially those who could expect higher levels of outcome from participating were not the ones who complied with the vouchers. So if you would like to change something, you would have to target these groups more specifically. So this is, I think, politically the most important message that we have to send. An unrestricted voucher program would be a loss of money. Now you would say, I would have come up to this conclusion before you did that experiment. Why did you use the time and money to do that? Well, I can tell you why. Because if you want to define the groups that you would treat in a restricted program, you would have to select some observables according to which you target the groups. And that's not so easy. The case which is in place till since 2001 in Switzerland is based on earnings as the criteria for inclusion or exclusion. And what we can show in this experiment is if you would take an earning level as a threshold, that you would say above that earning you are not entitled to get a voucher, you do it completely wrong. Because we can show with this experiment that you have a lot of people participating in education already now with low earnings if they have a higher education. And we have a low participation rate among the higher earners with low educational qualification. So what we can demonstrate with that experiment is educational qualifications should be the criteria according to which you should divide the population in those who are entitled and not. And well, that's the hope that potentially that would generate higher returns. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm open for questions.
likely then to use them and then to get higher responses at the end.
Yeah. Yeah, we looked at the interactions, but actually the interactions were not significant. So, but that would just tell you whether there's a difference in the elasticity of response to the amount of the voucher, and that difference is not different. But what you can see is that the probability of doing adult education when you include educational background variables, those variables remain significant if you include earnings. But the earnings, when you just include first earnings and then include educational background, the earnings falls out. So it means that this is because of that interaction that I told you, that people with a high education, they always participate independent of whether they have high earnings or low earnings, and that the opposite is true for people with low educational qualification.
Yes, very interesting presentation. I wanted to ask whether you introduced, I saw you flashed some of the controls that included things like married and so on. I wondered if you had information about the education levels of other family members,
No.
or at least relatives, to see whether there would be something of a catch-up thing. So if you may have had lower education yourself, but if the sibling or another relative had higher education, maybe there would be more of a tendency.
That would be an interesting issue to look at, but the labor force survey only asks about the person that is surveyed. The household survey, which is another data set, that would include that kind of data, but we have to rely on this data. So what we included was pretty much everything we got and was related to either outcome or adult education. So, for example, we know that people with small children have lower probabilities, etc., etc. So we included all the variables which, either based on empirical observation or theoretical assumptions, should have an impact on these variables. But that's the only ones we got. So about the spouse or other things, we don't have information in the labor force survey.
On the household, you meant you said you were linking these Swiss family living. What was it's the labor survey?
It's a labor force survey, but the labor force survey just asks the person surveyed.
Okay, that's it.
The household survey would do that, but that's a different data set.
So I have a few questions. One is just to clarify, the labor force survey, are you allowed to be in the survey if you're unemployed or not?
Yes.
Okay, so in that context, could you speak to that literature on sort of training programs with the unemployed with this particular experiment? So if you know someone is unemployed, they received the voucher, I didn't see you do a crosstab on that.
Yeah, that will be the mirror image of what we have been looking at. We looked here also because of the data, the sample size. We looked at the people who were employed in 2006 and then looked whether they were still employed in 2007. Actually, we did also the reverse, but the picture is the same. So we looked at the people unemployed or non-employed, let's say non-employed, because unemployment rates are so low in Switzerland that you get in trouble with sample size. But if you take the overall non-employed category, so then we looked at the probability of being employed 2007. Now the thing is, in the IV, it's not significant due to the same issues of standard errors, but actually the coefficient is a little bit larger and negative. What it tells you is something that we also anecdotally saw in the what happened among the group of non-employed people. The people redeeming the voucher are especially high qualified women who have no intention at all to integrate at a future stage in the labor market, but who like participating in education. So one of our sub-conclusions to the government was don't give the vouchers to non-employed people, because there the dead weight loss would be even bigger.
So just a couple follow-ups. First of all, I have to applaud your design of the experiment. It seems like, you know, you've overcome a lot of the flaws in a lot of experiments that we've studied here in the US. And so some of my questions are actually antithetical to the design, right? So it'd be, to me, it's interesting to think about how the different people who took up different kinds of programs may have had different effects. My guess is maybe there was no differences there because of sample size in the IV and so forth. But I guess you made the point about you'd expect the effect to show up immediately and not 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, right? And wanted us to buy in on that. And I would think that different kinds of education might show up longer term versus shorter term, right? So, as I said with the preamble, that my question violates the spirit of the experiment, which is just give someone a voucher, let them pick. Do you have anything you can say on that?
Well, about the duration of the experiment, we cannot do anything because we were not allowed to follow the treatment group beyond 2007. And then we would also have run into a nutrition problem. But of course it would have been very interesting to see whether something shows up at a later stage. Now the other thing is interesting, of course, we did a lot. We looked, for example, at subsamples who did only IT courses or people who did only language courses to see whether among these groups there were different effects. Concerning the outcomes, it's always the same story. Concerning the take-up rates, there are different stories, although. So, and some interesting. So more interesting about the take-up than perhaps about the outcomes, and perhaps there the outcome, because of that short-term vision, is not a good outcome measure. To tell you this, if you look if we look at IT courses, what you see in the OLS for people before the voucher, you see a very dominant age structure. That means the older you are, the lower is your probability of participation in IT, and which is one of the problems, because especially the older employed population should be engaged in this. And so what we found is that the voucher reversed that picture. The take-up rate was significantly higher among the older people, and as I said, for courses that are really labor market related, not Nintendo, so it flattens out the age effect. So in the treatment group for IT education, there is no age effect anymore. That's an interesting thing. Now, and a good thing from the perspective of the government. And I guess that a lot of those people doing that were doing it just to catch up in terms of skills and competences with where they should be now. And if you assume that this is the case, you would not expect any positive impact on earnings or employment. The only thing that could happen is that you could decrease a little bit your chances of being laid off, but in a country where laying off people is so infrequent, not much happens, but doing it now prevents you to fall back in salaries or increase that unemployment risk perhaps in 3 years' time, 5 years' time, 10 years' time. So it's a good thing in relation to long-term goals of integration in the labor market. And if you believe that, then the limitation to short-term effects is probably is a problem of that setup.
Could you comment on the governmental responses to your study?
That's the deception. So we did it, mandated by the government. And there was a press conference held by the government telling the people about the results, and then it was over. it's probably one of the only pieces of research that I have been doing in my life that has gained no public attention. The science response was quite the opposite, but the public use of these, and there are two reasons for that. One is not related to, both are not related to me, but one was a particular thing that happened in the policy process. There were some parties advocating tax reductions for if you participate in adult education, and they saw this as a threat. Because those parties that advocated the tax reductions, they want to give a gift to their constituency that are mostly high earners. Now, from a policy perspective, this is all dead weight loss. And especially those who would need that kind of training, they cannot get anything out of that tax reduction, because the tax reduction, because of the progressive tax scale, they get nothing back. So only those people get something back who would have done it anyway, but the politicians don't care about this because they just want the votes. So actually that was what happened. They were just discussing this in Parliament, the tax reduction, when that study came out. And they saw it as a huge threat, because the studies advocated for another group of people who should benefit. And they thought, well, if we already spend the billions on the high earners, we won't have the money to spend for the low. So if we say the vouchers is a good thing for the low earners, that would endanger our tax scheme. So that was the reason number one, because they really suppressed that paper. And the second thing was that the topic of adult education was in the past exclusively non-economics in my country. So that's a large educationalist group that deals with that topic. And I could show you the literature, up so far, they have written, even 2 weeks prior to the publication of that study, there was a study coming out from a university in Switzerland saying money doesn't matter. Adult education, money has nothing to do with it. It's all about what you think about education, how inclined you are, and what the information you have, and especially the information thing killed that study. Because they earn a lot of money by selling information about educational programs. So even from other countries, Austria, the Netherlands, Belgium, I was attacked in newspapers. They tried to find the flaws in that study, because they saw it as a threat to their story. It's all about information, but they earn their money with that information. And that study said, no, it's not about information. So these are the two reasons why, on the political level, nothing happened. There was another question?
I was wondering whether employer attitude towards their employees taking off to take those courses played a role in employees' likelihood to participate. 30 years, 40 years ago, the military was sort of seen as an educational or leadership course training part, and private companies used to hire officers, and they wouldn't mind if they had to take 3 or 4 weeks off a year because it was training, and now those private companies don't like to hire those officers anymore because they spend so much time away. Did your study address that in some way, or are you intending to do a follow-up study about that?
Well, that's quite limited in that sense, because we don't know anything about the view of employers. We have a lot of information about who they are, the branches, the sector, the size. We know whether the person has a management position or not, but we don't know anything about the employer itself in its view to adult education. The only thing that we know is that employers are highly selective in to which employees they grant the access to paid adult education. And we could show that the voucher can overcome some of this selectivity. Now, the problem with that is that if the selection that the employers are doing is perfectly right, because they know who is productive and who is not. They know if I send her to adult education, she will gain. If I send her, nothing will happen. So I don't give her that right because I have that information about how useful it would be to them. So they have superior information than the government has when they issue vouchers. So one of the problems with this selectivity of employers by paying adult education is if they are right and if they don't discriminate, if they have a long-term view about this investment, then interfering in that system would even be negative in terms of public gains, because you would only support those who should not be supported. But there are reasonable doubts that employers are so perfect in that, because they are not long-term interested. Most of the employers are very short-term interested. So for example, if you said, I will take that course because it will increase my job market possibilities, with that investment I can move up the ladder. I can go into a management position and earn the double of the salary. But it's outside my company because these jobs only exist at the competitors. Your employer would never invest in you. From a public perspective, the investment is positive, but from the perspective of the employer, it would be negative. So in that case, the voucher could overcome some of these imperfections in the market due to the short-term orientation, etc., of the employers. That's the reasoning about that. More we cannot say.
Just on that very point, I work on developing countries, and so many of the countries have, especially those where they do have the informal sector really dominates the economy, and so that characteristic is there. And I'm wondering, are there some studies? Do you know of studies, or have you been involved in any studies in developing countries where maybe that case could be made much more positive?
Well, there are some recent voucher studies in developing countries, but they all concern formal education, early formal education, as far as I know.
No, I meant the
But not about continuous education. So that is it. Well, thanks very much.
Can I invite all of our guests from the Swiss Consulate? The school wanted to give you each a little memento for coming today. This is for you. Thank you so much. And then I think we can have informal, I know that Professor Wolter.
They're very careful.
Yeah.
This is for you.
I'm not entirely sure.
Please feel free to talk to. Can I get a picture of you guys together? Or don't you block this?
Yeah, maybe over here so that we. What?
Sure.
Whomever you want.
Everybody, they want to take a picture, so could you please come to the front? This is your picture.